So in this second assignment, I want to give some suggestions for taking greater scholarly strength to your assignment. So it asks you firstly to consider a quote by Vardy, and I suggest that you might want to include, and it would be good to include, some material from this quote, but you need to be careful that you use these words clearly, effectively, and well, and don't quote them and then mishandle the quotes. But you could quote, "Truth can't be arrived at easily," or you could quote one of these other aspects of his quote. You could focus on Vardy's claim that relates to the subject of critical thinking. That is, truth is not only not arrived at easily, but by a struggle. And you could talk about the struggle for searching, being open to alternatives. I think that's quite important. It's only found by those who live the truth, and there's others who've talked about the importance of living the truth. Soren Kierkegaard is one. And then it talks about the veils of illusions. I think that's a key thought, is that it's very easy to miss the truths you're talking about through the veils of illusions. And Peter Harrison, in the lessons we did on science and history of science, talks about sin misleading us. He says that founders of science like Francis Bacon said that human nature, sin, self-focus leads us to mistruth. So you talk about those sort of things from Vardy. Don't forget, we're looking at critical thinking. So that's the one key area that you want to be covered in your assignment. And then we're also looking at effective learning. So in the second half of your assignment, you could interact with syllabus material and talk about learning. And you could focus on one area of learning, such as management of the students, and we don't see fully what's going on, and how do we know what's going on in the heads of the students and in their family and the background. And I've put together a video on critical thinking in the first week and some notes on critical thinking. You can go back over that. So we're also suggesting, particularly in the second half, you could think about your subject area. If you focus on just one subject area, like English or music, it'll often be stronger than two subject areas, because the more you cover, the thinner it gets. And it's the same with the guidelines that are in the subject outline. If you focus on some of the key guidelines and you allow them to focus your work, that'll work well for you. But if you try and cover everything in the subject guidelines, you can cover too much and do it too light and thin. So begin with a focus area, such as something from Vardy, something from critical thinking, how children learn, approaches to education, something from the education area, and begin by thinking about your subject area and your educational teaching practices, and choosing one subject will often do better. And you could ask, how does your subject contribute to critical thinking, and how does critical thinking contribute to your subject? You could focus on aspects of critical thinking in general, or you could focus on critical thinking in your subject area, such as literacy, language, assessment, classroom behaviour. Again, if you try and cover too much, then you'll have a thinner essay. And then all the way through, I think the secret is to gather strong scholarly resources. So beware of having a paragraph with no scholarly resources. Beware of starting just with your ideas, although you might want to write down your ideas at the beginning. But the real strength of your essay will come from finding strong scholars who've written about the areas that we're looking at. And you can find some of these strong scholars in the representative references in the outline. So if you wanted to Google those, you could, or the names that we've used, or you could find some in other subjects that you've done as well. But remember, you shouldn't be repeating more than 5% of what you've done in another subject in this subject. Otherwise, it'll lead you into the other subject, not into this subject, and it would also be shown up in the Turnitin plagiarism checker. So you want 3 to 5 really strong scholars that you're working with, and that could be maybe in your subject area, literature, English, behaviour management, or particularly in the subject we're looking at, critical thinking and how we think well. Remember, we are also asking you to think on what's formed your own personal worldview in terms of, say, modernity and in terms of Christian thinking. And my suggestion is that Charles Taylor is one of the leading people on the subject of modernity. But there's lots of other scholars who will have written on modernity as well. And in terms of Christian worldview, one that I really like is N.T. Wright, but there'll be others who've written on Christian worldview as well. There's lots of them out there. But make sure you've got a strong scholar, PhD, professor in a recognised university who's writing about these things. So remember, this isn't about worldview in general. It's about worldview that relates to critical thinking, worldview that relates to teaching your subject area in the years that are coming up, and what could go wrong where we misread and don't know fully what's going on, and what can go right when we can use scholarly disciplines like psychology, sociology, literary studies, science studies, math studies to better understand the way we think critically. In terms of using the first person, I'm suggesting the best advice is not to use the first person as much as you can. And one solution is to write your first person entry into a diary. Say, in reflecting on my life journey, my interest in English, literature or music grew out of, and you can write all the first person you want in the diary entry. And then when you bring it over into your essay, you could then think about, in reflecting in my diary entry, I wrote, and then scholars have said, they say, third person about the ideas that you observe in your approach to modernity and music. Yeah, so thoughts and questions on how to do this assignment, Jackson?
I think it was very helpful just like to clarify some of the scholars. I think helps direct, I suppose, where to draw my attention and my time when looking for good supporting evidence from other sources. So yeah, and so I think obviously having enough strong scholars as well. So 3 to 5, I'd probably aim more for the 5, and then also how to include, although it says in the question, reflect on the various influences that have formed your own personal worldview. Just kind of ways to twist that so it's not so much first person or very minimal. That's been very helpful. Yeah.
And certainly one way to go to get scholars fairly quickly is to go to somewhere like Google Scholar, and then to put in critical thinking applied to education. And then on the right-hand side, you can see those that you've got access to. And so here's a scholarly article, 2017. And then we have a look. We notice that it's, we're looking to make sure it's a scholarly article. It might be written in Spanish. That's going to make it more difficult. So you're looking for scholarly articles that you can then interact with, and you're looking for those that are most relevant. There's a lot on nursing education. So you could say in English education. So again, by focusing on the subject area that you're looking at, so critical thinking skills and meaning in English language teaching. A lot of them, when you go to English, it'll say second language, which makes it more difficult. But so here we've got an article perhaps on critical thinking in English language. So if you look through Google Scholar, you often find some good resources. The more recent they are, the better. The more they recognise strong scholarly journals and strong scholarly colleges, the better as well. And then in the end, you're going to have these 3 parts. There's going to be something about your worldview, modern Christian, And then there's going to be something about your subject topic area, and you can go to the syllabus documents for your subject area, English. And then how it's outworked in a class. That is, how do you effectively teach it? So you've got 2 or 3 sections. What you really want is one strong argument that carries through all of these. And you'll usually understand that after you've done 70% of your work, when you're realizing that scholars on critical thinking are saying that we often say critical thinking is about clarity from a scientific approach. What do we know? But what's often missed in this is, say, feelings and aesthetics and understanding the whole person. And you could say Christianity brings an understanding of the whole person. So there'll be insights like these, aha moments, as you gather the information, and then you really know what is the best material to share after you've done your research. So really, you know most about what is going to work best after you've done 50 to 70%, 80% or more of your research. And a lot of this has to do with literature review, whereby you're looking for the best scholars writing the best material about these subject areas that you're interested in: your worldview, Christian worldview, modern worldview, and then how's that apply in critical thinking in your subject area. Yeah, so further thoughts or questions, Jackson?
I don't have any more questions. Yeah, I just think it's been a great help. So thank you.
Yeah. Another thought I have is some students use what they call a 7-day method. That is, sometimes you have 7 days to write an assignment. And if you only have 7 days, 1 week to write an assignment, they suggest that sometimes we think that 6 or 7 days should be spent on research. But I've had a student tell me that really only half, 3 days, should be spent on research, and 3 days should be spent on writing it up and editing the work, because it's the polished, finished product that really presents the argument that you think clearly, that you think effectively, that makes it all hang together. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So put an effort in the first 3 days to get the best scholarly material, the best scholars, the best scholarly writing, and then spend an equal amount of time, 3 days, writing it up and editing. And then halfway through on day 4 is when you're really going to do the best job of creating the structure and laying it out as it's going to be finally produced. So I think that 7-day plan is a good reminder of the balance between research from the best scholars, the structure, and writing. Someone has said that your best ideas might come to you when you're going for a walk or something like that. So sometimes people will do some reading in the afternoon, gathering material, sleep on it, wake up next day, go for a walk, and then they'll take a notepad with them or have their iPhone with them, and they'll write some notes, because there can be some aha moments about, this is what it's all about. These are the insights. So note-taking can be very important there. So the literature review is trying to find the top scholars, the best scholars, both recent scholars in the last 10 years or so, but also over the centuries. There have been scholars as well who've given important work. Jackson, you've mentioned English. Any thoughts on who the top scholars are in English? When I was looking at it, the one that stood out to me was Wittgenstein. But have you come across Wittgenstein?
No, I haven't.
No. So anyway, he's just one who wrote on meaning of language, and there would be others. But it intrigued me as to who sort of scholars might be that. Any come to mind, or it's buried in another subject?
Yeah, no, I can't think of anyone top of my head.
Yeah. So often you do find, these scholars who tend to shape your views. But yeah, Wittgenstein was an interesting one that I came across a few times. I looked at philosophy of English, philosophy of language. And then since he came up a few times, then I thought I need to look more at Wittgenstein. And so you can see once you find a scholar like that, you can explore it a bit. You've got to be careful. You don't want a rabbit warren that takes you in the wrong direction. You do want something that takes you in the right direction. And so you always take a bit of a risk. So you really want to really charge very quickly into the work of the scholar. And you want about 5 minutes just to test it and find out whether it's going to work. But he has ideas here about the meaning of words. And I thought, in language learning, it's about learning the meaning of words. And so I thought, and then you can try ways to quicken the process. And so, and one of them is Wikipedia, but you're not allowed to use Wikipedia. So that's a double-edged sword. So I guess you can go to Wikipedia as long as you don't quote it and you don't camp there and dwell there too long. But it just gives you a quick summary of who Wittgenstein is. So you don't want to stay there too long. But the main idea that comes out is that he wrote 2 pieces of writing on English and language. First one is Tractatus on saying that we use words in that we want to understand objects, and so that worked quite well for him. And so that's a reasonably straightforward insight. Plato and Aristotle might have said the same thing. And then he took a break and did some teaching and other things. And then he thought about what he's wrote. And then he said, no, really, words often aren't about objects and things. Often they're about concepts that are quite different, long way away. So he came back and wrote very different things about what language and English was all about. So there's 2 different phases of his life and writing. But you wouldn't quote from Wikipedia because you don't know who's writing this stuff. But you could then go to Wittgenstein and English language teaching. Take it right to section 3 of your assignment and what's it going to be on. So you could go there, Wittgenstein and English language teaching, find some articles there, and particularly the scholarly articles. So this is just one way of exploring a rabbit hole, but you need to be careful because these will get you into trouble if you go down a rabbit warren that goes away from what you're wanting to look at. So it needs to be used with care. I've stumbled here on a thesis, a Master of Arts thesis on communicative language teaching, Wittgenstein. So I think 2009, it's likely to have some valuable insights. Again, a quick look. We've got communicative language teaching. So this is, and I would present something about how language teaching is one of the major areas that we do. It's always good to argue that what you're writing about is very, very important. So if you wrote down communicative language teaching, English language teaching, these are very, very important aspects of education and what we're setting out to do. So a quick glance at this sort of material may be helpful, but again, the secret's skim learning and quickly moving on if it doesn't have the sort of material that you're looking for. So that's just my example of exploring a rabbit warren. I found the name Wittgenstein, I began to explore it further. And another one that we said was Charles Taylor. He's written on modernity, and we're throwing in what we're focusing on, education. And so again, doing a very quick look at that sort of area that we're researching on. I think as well, enjoy the journey. Don't get stressed if you find something too hard to read, if you find something too difficult to understand, then go back to good, solid, sound areas that you can follow and understand. So I think don't get stressed, enjoy it. If you put in the time and if you read sound resources and keep focused in the subject area as outlined in the outline, then you'll do well. Yeah. So what are going to be the next stages, Jackson, over, you've got about 7 days, I imagine, to do the assignment. So about 10 days.
Yeah, should be, I suppose like for me, it'd be like the next few days would be making sure I get on top of the research aspect and making sure I have a good supporting evidence from the points that I already have in mind. So yeah.
Yeah, and certainly one of my thoughts would be to keep to your what the essay is asking you to do. So even go to the outline and regularly, almost every day, read through the outline of the subject, remind yourself of what's this essay setting out to do. So keeping focused is going to be very, very important. And so if you go to the important information section on Moodle, download the subject outline and then carefully read what's required, then that'll help keep you focused. And so, and it's worth reminding yourself as well, what's the subject about? It's about critical thinking and it's about teaching effective learning. And so it's to help you learn, to help your students learn to think critically. And then you can quickly remind yourself of the outcomes we're looking at. We're looking at ways of knowing. And so how do we know in a critical, sound way? So you can have a look through those. There's graduate attributes. You could very briefly just glance through those. But the most important thing is going to be on the essay itself. So if you look at the assessment, the minor essay, firstly, there's parts of the quote by Vardy. So you really want to take a couple of pieces from this, of which I think one of the most important things is that we can easily find that what we think is true is veiled, is illusion, is false. And I think that's one of the real problems in learning about truth and in education when you accept things that aren't true. So reflecting on your influences, a quick way to get there is identify something like modernity, what's influenced you, Christian worldview, what's influenced you. In terms of ways of knowing, we have that list of ways of knowing in the diagram on the ways of knowing. And in the subject, we say that the ways of knowing include the senses. And so particularly in the scientific revolution, there's a focus on the senses. In Aristotle, there's a focus on the senses. So how important is ways of knowing in teacher education? It's certainly important in that this is one of the major ways in which students learn is through sense experience. And the more senses you can involve, the better. So you do a little bit of search on that. Another way of knowing is like mathematics, where it's logical reasoning. It's more the deductive, inductive reasoning. You're not using the senses so much, you're using your mind to think. And so that's why every year of school, there's an emphasis on mathematics and other reasoning subjects. So you do a bit of a search on that. And then language. So if you're an English teacher, then you might want to think, how language is important as a way of knowing not only the subject area, and so in terms of language as a way of knowing, it's fascinating. How do we know so much through words? And it's a huge philosophical question, in that obviously if you look at a pair of shoes or socks, then the words can describe the object, which is what Wittgenstein said in his first bit of writing. But when it comes to maths, 2 + 2 = 4, that goes beyond looking at two objects. These are concepts that are ideas. When we talk about beauty, or when we talk about God, it's difficult to get beauty in the palm of your hand or God in the palm of your hand. So ways of knowing through language are much bigger, they're more challenging than we can imagine. And that's why we often use metaphors, etc. So there's areas you can explore there in terms of a way of knowing through language. And then one that you could include, if you're interested in music, etc., is the way of knowing through the aesthetic, through the emotional, through the intuitive. And this shows the second half of our brain rather than just the logical part of the brain. There's the whole imaginative part of the brain, the intuitive part of the brain. And so, and maybe that's part of the postmodern age that we live in. Now, of course, ways of knowing can be manipulated politically and through propaganda. And this is part of the challenge that postmodernity has pointed out, is that in a postmodern world, gender is being manipulated in terms of males, boys do so well at mathematics. Oh, if girls could only do as well as boys. Well, there's a lot of gender statements in that. And so language contains a huge amount of politics and propaganda. And then there are cultural differences as well. And if you had time and space, you could include something about culturally diverse ways of knowing, including first language, First Nation ways of knowing. And then faith, is that another way of knowing? And theologians have written on faith as a way of knowing, existential ways of knowing. And we touched on that in the Science Week when we touched briefly there on beyond science into different ways of knowing in psychology, beyond behavioral psychology. And then there's all the fields of knowledge that we look at. So that can be touched on. There's resources that we cover, and so you could look at some of those resources, particularly if they focused on the area you're looking at. But you've got to be careful of going down too many rabbit warrens there. You could also look at the assessment rubric, and that can be helpful, but you don't want to get bogged down there. So we're looking at philosophy positions on ways of knowing. We're looking at influences that shape our worldview. So we live in the modern world. And what does this mean for our approach to teaching? We measure things. We look for evidence, evidence-based results. What's the strength of this and the limitation of evidence-based results? We're looking at multiple facets of teaching. So teaching is not just about mastering the literacy or numeracy. It's about motivation, it's about feelings, it's about relationships. We're looking at educational research and then behaviour. People behave better when they fit well into the approach that we are taking. So there's a lot that's covered there in the rubric that you could briefly have a look at in the assignment. So any questions on those, Jackson?
No, I don't have any questions. No, that was good. I think it just helped bring back some ideas that you were saying before, like how you can go and you gave the example of people going on walks and ideas coming to mind. And for me, it's at other moments. And for me, I had ideas, but now it's just come back now. So
Yeah. And that happens when we read too, and when we read a scholarly piece. And I find that we then read down a few different areas. So we might read something on critical thinking and education, and there'll be some ideas come to us there. And I would then say keep a page, perhaps, where I write notes on critical thinking and education. And then I would always save the website where I go to that has that resource. And then I come across, say, Charles Taylor, Modernity. So I might start writing notes on modernity and collecting that. But again, always saving the website. And so making a copy of where I found it and pasting that into my notes so I can find it again. And then in the end, you have to find the more exact reference, author date, and to get that polished up. Yeah. Yeah. So going for walks is our recommendation for a study method.
Works, then by all means.
Yeah. And I guess you want to be a bit bold and brave, and you want to explore ideas you have, but at the same time, you've got to back these ideas up. And so you don't want unsupported ideas, but you want to start to explore the possibility that the idea works. And so, we're looking at modernity. One of the safest ways to cover that is to talk about both the strengths and limitations of so this modern approach where we'll seek to define things, we'll seek to use maths, we seek to be exact in the way we describe it. It brings us lots of benefits in terms of medicine, but the limitation is that that's not all that human beings are about. It's being strongly defined. And then modernity perhaps arises in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s as the benefits of defining what is there. So I think you possibly want some quotes on what modernity is if you decide that's the way of describing what your worldview is. Okay. And then similar with your subject area, you can choose a subject area. You want to choose one aspect of it and focus on that. So it could be English, or it could be two subject areas, English music. And you could talk about how the modernists focus on exact meaning. One of the fascinating things with English language is exact meanings of words. And so you can have dictionaries that define words, the Oxford Dictionary, and yet the postmodern approach recognises that language can have a huge range of meanings, and it's more creative, and maybe it's the unexpressed. And one of the really challenging things is when it comes to beauty and God, these are unexpressible. And so English could play around with concepts like those, and sort of explore them. But we want scholars, and more scholars that you need to quote and cite in your material. And so I think that's the challenge, is to engage with scholars and what they've said, but at the same time, explore your own thoughts and ideas. And so it's that challenging balance between what scholars are saying and what you are exploring. So in our brief discussion today, Jackson, what are two or three things that have stood out?
I think for me it was, I'm just reading through my notes. I think for me, I'd be now looking at focusing on more one subject, just so I can create more of a stronger argument in my essay. Which one that would be between music and English at this point, I'm not sure. I guess I'll go away and think about it and see which one I kind of more closely resemble and can find better supporting evidence for. But then the second one would be more the worldviews. So I'm leaning definitely more towards, the more modern worldview. And so how I can tie everything in together.
Now, with the music, if you go to Jeremy Begbie, Theology and Music, I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but certainly Jerry Begbie's written some brilliant material on theology and music and the ways music shapes us. And you could begin with a statement that music might be undervalued in education, whereas there are arguments that music is so valuable that it's valuable for every student, whether they can play an instrument or not. And music is perhaps under-considered. And then Begbie's written a great deal on that. And there'll be others that you'll come across as you begin to explore theology, philosophy, and music. In terms of English, the clear advantages of looking at English as a area. Language is important for us in thinking, and literacy is important, which is why even governments and politicians like to talk about literacy, and it's important. So clearly you can build a case there. And when it comes to modern worldview, find some strong scholars who've written on modernity. So if you go to Google Scholar and then start to explore what is modernity, and then the hypothesis is that modernity is a worldview that shapes us. And so we've got scholars here who are writing on the meaning of modernity. And then you can try and focus that a bit more by in education and teaching, and that can help focus the whole essay, and it can also make it more relevant for you. So if you look at modernity in education and teaching, that can be useful as well. And certainly modernity has so shaped the way we think in terms of the way the world's run. But postmodernity has also shaped our world. That is, it's about emotions and thinking. When it comes to advertising, there don't seem to be any facts in the adverts I see on telly. It's all emotion. So it's not modern at all. It's not communicating information. It's a postmodern advertising world. And when it comes to some politicians, there's not facts. It's postmodern emotive statements. So it's a bit strange that way. And then the Christian worldview. Any thoughts on how you might define a Christian worldview? A good way to go is to find a theologian who looks at what the Christian worldview is. So again, if you go to Google Scholar and look at what is the Christian worldview, and then find a scholarly book. So J.P. Moreland, Philosophical Foundations of the Christian Worldview, looks as though if you can access that. Some of these, they say you can access them. Yes, I think good scholarly material is what you're needing there to strengthen what you're doing, which means a strong scholarly book and strong scholarly journal articles. Yeah. Any further questions or thoughts, Jackson?
I don't think I have any questions. Trying to think of thoughts.
Yeah.
No,
So
I think
it'll be a very valuable assignment. It's practical application to where you're at. Certainly gives you a chance to think on how do you think. But again, you don't have time in the essay to really go on there. So I think that's more a journal reflection. And then you bring from a journal or a diary that you keep to the essay. And so you might want to, each week when you're teaching, reflect on how's it going, how's your thinking going, and reflect on big questions such as this. What's the meaning of truth? What's my motivation for teaching? And then you bring some of those thoughts into essays such as this. And that's the value of doing a bachelor or a master's in education. It's a chance to take your thoughts and ideas and then to have opportunity to examine them more deeply and fully, to develop them more deeply and fully. And this is an essay opportunity to think about what's your way of viewing the world, why is it important, what's your way of viewing the world as a Christian, why is that important, what's your understanding of the importance of subjects you're teaching like English and music, why are approaches to these subjects and why are these subjects themselves so important, and how do you go about sharing that with other students so they catch the excitement about these subjects. So there's a lot there that you can do. So again, the challenge is to interact with scholars, but also reflect on how do you view things. Some people say don't include any of your own views, whereas I think 50-50, it's got to be your own views and scholars' views, but you're not just writing your own views in first person. I think music is wonderful because I love it. You're thinking about what scholars say. Scholar Jeremy Begbie says that people are attracted to music because it takes them into a timeless space where they can explore the creative inner aspects of their life that aren't enabled in more logical modernist approaches to thinking. And so it's the scholars that open up opportunities for us to explore these other ways of going. And then if you want to have a quote from the syllabus documents on subject area, you go there to your syllabus documents, quote them and cite them. So a good number of references, 12 to 15 or more is usually best, and more is usually best rather than less, though it's the depth of engagement with the resources that counts, and it's the scholarly thinking about the resources that counts, and it's exact thinking. So you want to be careful with the language, which means you're going to have a few days editing and revising your work, polishing it so it's not just loose language. So thanks for coming on board today, Jackson.
No worries. Thank you.
Sounds good. So I might pop this up for some other students if they want to have a look too. If that's okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks then.
All right, take care.
Touch.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.